And joining us now on the line from Vancouver, British Columbia, Peter Robinson. He's CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation. And Peter, as I welcome you to the program, I want to share what you already know with our viewers, which are essentially these new guidelines that the Canada Revenue Agency has put out. So we'll just take a moment off the top here to share that, and then we'll come back with some questions. For example, the Canada Revenue Agency will be revising the Registered Charity Information Return Form to collect more information about political activities. Gifts from a charity to a donee to carry on political activities would count against both the donor charity and the recipient organization's existing limits allowed for political activities. And one more, if a registered charity fails to provide complete and accurate information in relation to any aspect of its annual return, the Canada Revenue Agency may suspend its tax receipting privileges until complete and accurate information is provided in the prescribed manner. Peter, the government says it's all about more transparency. What's your reaction?
Well, it likely is about more transparency, but we should sort of carefully look at what those three components are. They're saying that they would like more accountability for political activity, but it's still very unclear within any of the CRA guidelines as to what that means. And so even with these new pieces of legislation, which they're tabling today, by the way, it'll still be very much trying to make sure that you anticipate the impact of what you're saying. There are buried deep within some of the policies that the CRA references to being partisan and nonpartisan. But by and large, most charities, and there's 85,000 in this country, still have to try to interpret it the best they can. On the other two areas that you just mentioned, certainly the first one, which is that if a charity donates to another charitable purpose, traditionally what would happen is the receiver would have to report if they were doing political activity within their filings. Under the new guidelines, the charitable group that actually provided the donation in the first part would also have to account as political activities what the receiving group did. I think the piece that's going to be the most, I wouldn't say troublesome so much as we'll have to keep a very close eye on it, is the notion that there's almost a discretionary ability to suspend the charitable status of an organization until such time as, I guess, the CRA deems that they've corrected whatever the behavior was. And the reason why I say we have to keep an eye on that is right now, so before this bill is passed, if a charity is deemed to be offside of the guidelines, what typically happens is the CRA comes back and seeks to educate the group as to what they might do to bring themselves back on side. And the reason why is they've only ever had the ability to essentially suspend completely sort of sanction and remove that charitable status. And so they were very reluctant to do it, as you can imagine. Why would you do that if you can try to hope the group comes back on side? But with the ability to do a temporary suspension, of course, all charities should be worried that this is a way to say that we're going to take an interim step. We'll put you in the penalty box for a little while until you have corrected your behavior. But any charity in this country that receives a temporary suspension is going to be in a lot of trouble because their donations will dry out.
Indeed. All right, let's do a real life example here then, following up on the first part. If charities are unclear about what they can and can't say vis-a-vis politics these days, here's the real life example. In the last Ontario election campaign, David Suzuki endorsed the Liberals, came out quite prominently and said, we like what the Dalton McGuinty government is doing on green energy. We suggest you vote for them. Do you think now those days are gone?
Well, we should, first of all, focus on that real life example because it's not quite what you just described. And I know that's how it's been portrayed. But David Suzuki, in last year, in advance of the election in Ontario, certainly did come out and say that he thought that the Green Energy Act, the Ontario's policy on how they treat energy and how they generate and feed into the tariff system, he said that was something that he thought was really quite strong, and he endorsed the policy. Now, somewhere along the line, of course, the way that communications go, it got in the repetition, kind of the echo chamber, that he was endorsing Dalton McGuinty. I think it's really important to know that organizations, individuals can say that certain policies are really strong. And in fact, the CRA recognizes that in their own guidelines, that they expect charities that have a vested interest or talk about education or health or social services, if they have an opinion about a policy, can either say it's really strong or it's weak in these areas.
I think, Peter, probably what happened was that the McGuinty people took a look at that endorsement of the policy and, put it out there as he likes our guy. These things happen in election campaigns.
No doubt. But I do think there's another point there, and this is that David Suzuki is a preeminent individual in this country. He's renowned, he's got books and titles, and he's won all kinds of awards. People know him through the CBC, of course. But he's entitled, like you and I are, to come out from time to time and make private statements. So I know, because I'm beside David on many times when he speaks. He will always, if he's going to venture into that area where he's giving a personal opinion, he says, I just want you to know I'm speaking as David Suzuki, the individual. Unfortunately, as you just mentioned, in the shortness and brevity of how news gets reported, they usually leave that part off and they just say, I say this, as opposed to, I'm speaking as an individual and I say this.
Okay, but the question now becomes, are those days gone anyway because of these changes that Canada Revenue Agency is bringing in?
Yeah, so that is the correct question. I've looked at the materials that are being tabled today, and of course the part that impacts on us the most is not the charity giving to another charity, because we don't do that. It would be around those more reporting on political activities. Now, we don't know what that is yet, and I suspect it won't be in the legislation. It'll be in guidelines that the CRA is going to have to figure out, and it's very tough to do this. In the meantime, what the David Suzuki Foundation would do is essentially what it's been doing to this point. There are guidelines. Those guidelines aren't changed in terms of you can spend up to 10% of your total resources on political activities. You just can't be partisan. So routinely, the organization will send out material, because we're an education and science-based organization. If we've done research on something related to fisheries on the West Coast, we'll certainly comment on potentially changes to the Fisheries Act and changes to fisheries policy. And we won't stop doing that, but we'll have to see what the guidelines will further state about political activity.
Okay, well, Peter, I'm making an inference here. He stepped down, David did, as the head of the organization that bears his name, presumably because he thought these new guidelines mean he can't express a political opinion anymore without potentially running afoul of these new rules. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Well, slightly. I mean, to be fair to David, he has always been outspoken. I mean, that's why Canadians love him. And what he had found is that in stating certain specific beliefs and things that he feels, usually what happens afterwards is there's a flood of people saying revoke the status of the charity, even though it had nothing to do with the David Suzuki Foundation. And so I think what he was attempting to do there is to say, I draw a lot of heat onto an organization that I believe is doing good work, and so I'm going to step off of the governance capacity of that organization to help them in this rather difficult time we're going through right now.
Okay, I presume you've been in touch with some of your colleagues at other similar organizations, and I'm wondering if you have detected, as a result of these new guidelines, some self-censorship or a bit of a chill on behalf of those who are running these organizations, lest they run afoul of the new guidelines. Help us understand that.
Yeah, the language that has been floated out there is a chill, and I've seen that written down. All charities in this current environment are certainly going to have to look at the activities they do to make sure that they don't cross over those lines. And it's really tough not to. In the heat of a scrum sometimes, and someone comes up to a staffer and says, what do you think about Canada's position on climate change? It's very tough not to step over the line from saying, these policies aren't going to help us achieve our goals and our international commitments, to say something that would be partisan as a hypothetical statement, like this government doesn't have a respectable climate change policy. So, you have to continuously do that. I can only speak from my perspective, which is that I certainly do look at what we say, what we do, to make sure that we're not going to run into something that will bring down the unintended consequence of somebody coming in and saying, we're going to put you through an audit. And I think that's something to pay attention to. There's a lot of organizations that are currently under a CRA audit, and if you've ever been, if any of your viewers have ever had a personal income tax audit or an organizational audit, they are,
It's
they
not a lot
tend
of
to
fun, we
detract
know.
from your work.
Yeah.
They're not a lot of
Well,
fun.
there's one organization out there that perhaps is not going to be on your Christmas card list anymore, and I'm talking about ethicaloil.org, because a little earlier this month they had the following to say: time to investigate the David Suzuki Foundation. With 12 registered lobbyists, this organization says, the David Suzuki Foundation has more lobbyists on staff than most government relations firms. Charities are supposed to do charitable work, feed the poor, take care of the sick, and fund life-saving advancements in medicine. Let's pull this apart a little bit. What's your response to what they've had to say about you guys?
Well, they're doing what they do to try to provoke and get public all sort of riled up on this. But I mean, anybody that first of all, dealing with sort of bureaucracies is tough at the best of times. You are required, if your staff are engaged in ongoing conversations with sort of political and or senior government people, to register under what is called the lobbyist registry. That doesn't mean we're necessarily lobbyists. If I have scientists inside DSF that are renowned for their work on sponge coral deep sea trawling, and they need to work with the Ministry of Fisheries on providing input, I have to register them as a lobbyist. I think most people think a lobbyist is somebody who's going to go in and shut the door and in a closed confine with the minister say, you need to do this. That's not what lobbyists are in the David Suzuki Foundation. In fact, everybody that's listed on there is essentially there because they may at one time or another have to have contact. I think the number of times that we've actually had to do that is maybe one person in the last year. It's just the requirement of how you register.
Okay, let's really get to the bottom of this. I wonder if you are really ticked off at these ethical oil folks, because essentially their position on developing the oil sands is the same as the Conservative government's. And, some people observe that they're really just a front for the Conservative government. Here they are trying to sick CRA on you. Are you a little ticked off at them?
Well, I'm annoyed, but I'm also slightly embarrassed that this would happen. Not for us, but for groups that are trying to somehow state that they have a moral compass. That, oh my gosh, look what the David Suzuki Foundation is doing. It is, and then they just filed a very lengthy document with all of these examples of things that we've done. And I looked at those and I thought, my gosh, I'm pretty proud of what we had said at various times. If you add all that up, first of all, if you look at it in isolation, you'd say, oh my gosh, look at all those things that the staff of the foundation are saying. But it's an $8 million organization that does very credible science work on a variety of environmental and energy and community issues. And you take that little bit of paper that they submitted as evidence of being offside, and you put it against the $8 million of staff and research and scientists that we do, and it's way less than 10%. So I'm ticked off that they're trying to make this into something which it's not, and I'm completely comfortable that we're on side with the guidelines. But I think the real underlying piece is, how embarrassing is it that this is coming from Ethical Oil in the first place? So who is this group? As you pointed out, they've got deep connections into the current government and into components of the oil and gas industry. They're not even trying to disguise what they're trying to do. But they don't report who their funders are. We don't know, except on their website, that they acknowledge that they may receive funding from the oil and gas sector. So I'm just thinking, surely Canadians see through this. I don't know how else you couldn't.
Well, let's just take their allegations, briefly here and hit them on the head as we go along. Do you think that your foundation has ever crossed the line in terms of its political engagement?
Well, not since I've been there, and I've been there for 4 years now. And I look at the information that we provide and that we report on, and I certainly work within the organization to make sure that we stay within the 10% guidelines. The partisan piece, and I wish that the CRA were a bit more clear on this, because it's very difficult. If you look at the example right now that's in the news of the Minister of Natural Resources making a statement that says that certain radical environmental organizations are, then pick one of the answers that he wants you to understand. So usually what happens is we're responding to that. We didn't start that conversation. So that comes out, and then we end up having to address these types of comments, because the media, God bless them, are saying, well, what do you think about this? And in that response, are we being partisan by identifying the minister and saying he said this, and how absurd is that? Well, that's a good question. How can you not respond to something that was lobbied against you in the first place?
Okay, fair enough. But for example, if you do happen to like the McGuinty government's green energy policies, will you going forward be able to say so?
Well, I sure hope so, because we will say this. In fact, we just issued a report about 2 weeks ago where we did a nonpartisan report card of all the provinces in Canada and evaluated them on certain environmental performances. And in those kinds of reporting, do you say both what is a really good policy and what are policies that need, in our view, further refinement and addressing? I don't think we would bother to change that at all. The real essence of this discussion would be, can you specify the names of individuals, and how do you make sure that the language stays as neutral as you can, which is tough to do when you get into emotionally charged discussions.
And how about this, Peter? Do you feel that these new guidelines were brought into place, I don't want to say solely for the purpose of taking a shot at you guys, but how about generally speaking? Do you think you were the target on this one?
Well, now that is a good question, because as I said earlier, there's 85,000 charities in this country. They do incredibly valuable work on the purposes under which charities can be characterized as, relieving the poor, advancing religion, advancing education, and purposes for the benefit of a community. So these are contributing to what I call a wonderful democratic society. So, and 85,000 charities, I can guarantee you that thousands of them are doing what we would describe as political activity, and in some cases probably also run into the same challenges that everybody else does as to what constitutes partisan. But I find it just so amazing that it's only environmental organizations that got singled out in this last 6 months. And in fact, the conversation starts last year with discussions about radical environmental organizations, and maybe we should be tightening up, and maybe we should be looking at international funding. And then lo and behold, the track of that goes through to the budget, which was announced recently, and then the Implementation Act today. And it doesn't take a David Suzuki scientist to recognize that this story is really about, in my mind, about trying to dampen down the voices of the environmental community and make them so that they're spending more time sort of looking at their own activities as opposed to doing the really good work they're trying to do. So I do think that the issue for Canadians, and you're raising it right now in your broadcast, is what does this say for the role of charities in this country? Can they? Because if it's environmental groups that are being singled out today, what happens if you're a social service group, or if you're a healthcare group, or something tomorrow? And I find that a bit troublesome.
Peter, it's good of you to join us on TVO tonight from the Left Coast. Thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure.
Peter Robinson, the CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.